Hello, this is the Bite Weasel, and in this video we'll be continuing our Roblox Tycoon game, focusing on building out some droppers for our existing buttons. So let's get into it. So we have the dropper buttons, but we don't have any droppers for those dropper buttons to build. So let's show you how we can sort of figure that out. First, I'm going to get rid of this button, the second button, so that we concentrate on just this one until we're ready. So this button is going to build a dropper, which is a very common thing in tycoons. Not all tycoons, of course, use droppers, but a lot of them do. So we're going to show you what that looks like right now. We'll build up a dropper using these parts. Now, of course, when you come to make your own game, you could use Blender or something to create a nicer looking dropper and better buttons, nice factory, that kind of thing. But for now, I'm just going to show you how it can sort of work here. Of course, remember to anchor the part because we don't want it flying around anywhere. So we'll duplicate it. We'll make another part to be sort of the arm that I guess sticks up. I guess too wide. It doesn't really matter. How tall should it be? Yeah, that looks pretty okay. Not great. But again, you can sort of use more time for your thing. Okay, so there is a dropper that looks like a dropper, I guess, sort of. Let's give it some colors. So the bottom piece can be, in fact, let's make all of the pieces smooth plastic and make them sort of, I don't know, a light bluey, pinky color, something like that is fine. Maybe the bottom piece will make slightly darker for whatever reason. There you go. You have a dropper that looks kind of bad, but you can imagine it's going to be better when you take more time. The only other piece that I kind of want on my dropper is somewhere to drop the block from, right? So, for example, I want it to drop from this point. So I will make this bit a bit smaller in the Y because I don't want it sticking out so much. And I will move it with collisions on so that it directly lines up with the bottom of that. And I'll give this one a special name because I'm going to want to use it later in my script. So that part is the part that will drop the item. So I've called it drop point, right? The point at which the item will get dropped from this thing. Now, again, the same way we did with buttons, I'm going to select all of these things. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say group as model. And now this is going to be my dropper model. And that's cool. Now that we have a button and a dropper, we can sort of get those two things interacting together. What we want to do is when someone stands on the button, we want it to build this dropper. So we're going to have to update the button script so that it can create this dropper when it's stood on. I was assuming you have enough money. And we're going to also want a new script that controls droppers so that when they're created, they start dropping items onto some sort of conveyor belt, right? That then sells stuff at the bottom. So where should we start? Well, let's start with getting the button to create the dropper. Okay, so we already have a button script that we can do stuff with. So let's get it instead of saying something when the button is touched. Instead, let's get it to build the associated dropper. Now, there are, much like with any part of coding, there are a million different ways to accomplish the same task. So the task that we're trying to accomplish is when I stand on the button, build this dropper and only this dropper. There are many ways to do that. And in some tutorials, what you'll see is using the button to add an attribute. And this attribute, we can sort of look up the name of the thing that we want the button to build. So attributes, much like tags, are a way of just adding arbitrary data to a particular item in your hierarchy. But with an attribute, you can check the type of thing. A tag is just, is it there or not? But an attribute has a value. So we can say, add an attribute of item to buy and have it as a string. And so in here, you would have something like, I want this button to buy the dropper. And that's cool. You could now go into the button script, and instead of printing this out, you could say, okay, get my attribute called item to buy, then search through the workspace for the thing with the matching name, and then build that thing or show that thing if it was hidden. And that is a good way of doing it. It would look a little something like this. It would be button get attribute, and the name of the attribute is item to buy, like this. And that would give us the dropper. So local to buy equals that. And then what you would do is something like workspace find first child, and the name of it is to buy, the value within there. And then you would, that's the dropper or the item that you're buying. And then at this point, you would have to show the item or build the item or whatever. So you would do to do show item, aka the dropper, right? And you would have code to do that. And that is cool, and that would sort of work. The problem comes that I find with this sort of approach with attributes is that when you duplicate these things, which you tend to do a bunch because you want a factory to have multiple droppers, we've already hit a bunch of problems. One is that this button and this button have the same name. Okay, fine. We'll go through and change that. And dropper, this second dropper also has a different name, so we have to change that. But now, inside this button, we also have to remember that the item to buy has changed. Like, if I look in the workspace for something called dropper, it's going to find this first one, not this second one, because I updated the name. So I have to go in here every time I duplicate a button and update that, which is a bit annoying because if I rename this later and I forget to go back to this associated one and update it, it's a bit of a pain. So that is one way of doing it, using attributes. But it's not the way that I like to do it. And I'll show you another alternative. And when you come to create your game, you can sort of pick and choose which technique you want to use based on how you end up building your level and how you understand these pieces of the code working. So instead of using an attribute, which just would contain the name of the item, I want an actual reference to that model that I want to build. And the way that you can do this is a thing called an object value. Now, an object value is, instead of it being assigned directly inside the model as an attribute, and we can get rid of this one because we don't need it anymore. It's actually an individual part, much like a part is or a billboard GUI. It's like a separate entity from the button. And what you can do is, inside the value, you can point it at another item in your workspace. And now that value has a reference to the actual object itself, not based on the name, not based on its position or its location in the hierarchy, but a direct reference to it. And that is cool. So if we change this to item to buy, much like we had the name of the attribute, but now we've got the name of this object value as item to buy. And now if I was to duplicate these two things, turn off collisions, and move this here, without needing to do anything else, this first button's item to buy points to, if I go to reference object, it will select it. The first button points to the first dropper, and the duplicated button, if I right click this one, points to the duplicated dropper. Even though they have the same name, even though they're the same position in the hierarchy, it knows that because it was a direct reference and you had selected both of them when you duplicated it, it automatically updates. And this is really cool because if later on I even decide to rename this one to Mega Dropper, I don't have to go and update anything else. If I go back to this second button that builds the Mega Dropper, you're going to see that it's already updated it automatically. because it is an object value, not an attribute. So I find object values to be very useful for direct referencing like this. Much better than I like attributes. I do like attributes for other things, and I use them a whole bunch. But for directly referencing two objects together, I like to use object values. Now, there are, of course, drawbacks with using object values, just like there are drawbacks with using attributes. And one of those things is because it is a separate entity to the model, you have to be very careful. So when a model gets created, Roblox will do this thing called streaming. The model will get loaded in the game, but without necessarily having all its individual pieces. It tries to do it in a performant, sort of really fast way. And so that can kind of be confusing when you have the button ready, but it hasn't yet streamed in the object value. So, one way to solve this, and of course there are multiple ways, is to actually change the way that Roblox sort of treats your model. Instead of using the default streaming behavior, you can change this to atomic. And this is kind of useful in some scenarios, such as this one. And what that means is Roblox will only consider this model as completely loaded and ready when every single piece of its hierarchy is also ready and loaded. So now I know, because I've set it to atomic, that this model will work as a single atomic piece. So it will only be ready and added to the world when each one of its children is also ready. So now, because it's set to atomic, I know if I have this button, the object value item to buy will also be ready. So that's a really handy thing to know, is the streaming mode. And using atomic for something like this is kind of handy. Because now if we go back to our button, we can actually use that thing a little better. What we want to do is, instead of going get attribute from the button, we need to get a reference to that child item to buy object value. So normally we'd go dot item to buy. But you'll notice we don't have that IntelliSense because Roblox Studio knows that our button is a button model, but it doesn't know that our button model has an item to buy object value in it, because we just added it. So we can update that. Item to buy is an object value, because we just added it, so we know that's what it is. And now if I go back here and I do dot, we're going to see item to buy is right there. And the value of that item to buy is going to be whatever you referenced with inside this thing. So in my case, it's a direct reference to that dropper. So now I don't need to search for the dropper in the workspace because I have it right there. It is this value. So now I would show the item, aka the dropper, however I want to do that. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're just going to show and hide these things. You could instantiate the dropper, but I like to show and hide them. And I'll show you why I like to do that later. So, how do you show and hide an item in Roblox? Well, you have to fiddle around with its transparency. Now, our model, of course, we know is a whole bunch of different parts. So we're going to need to loop through all of these parts and change the transparency to 0 to show them or 1 to hide them. Because we want to show them, we want the transparency set to 0, right? I think that's right. Now, we could write all that code ourselves, but one of the other kind of handy things in Roblox Studio is their AI suggestions feature. And what this is there is basically some part of Roblox Studio in the background is constantly looking at the code you're writing, and it's trying to think of a suggestion to help you along your way. So much like when you do button dot, it sort of suggests the things for you. You can actually get it to write you more code by giving it a comment as a hint to the type of code that you want it to write. So for example, we could do something like this, and I'm not entirely sure it's going to work, but let's take a look. We can do a comment with those two dashes and say, loop through the to buy model and set all the children parts to be transparent equals 0. Is that right? And then what you can do is, you see those two dots that were happening? Roblox has sort of read your comment and has now generated what it thinks is a good piece of code to implement that comment. And so if you like that, you can say, and it says right here, press tab to accept it. And now, just by writing a comment, Roblox has sort of filled in code that it thinks will do whatever you wrote in the comment. And let's take a look. It's not always accurate, so you do need to go back and make sure you understand what it's doing. But let's take a look. So for each part in the children of our item called to buy, it's going to look if that part is a base part, and if it is, it's going to set the transparency to 0. That's cool. That's exactly what we wanted it to do. So Roblox has then generated this code for us without us needing to think about how we do a for loop or how we check if a part is a base part and so on. And that's really quick, and it's really compelling to be able to do this. Now, of course, in this world, the dropper is already opaque, like it's already got all its transparency set to 0. But what we can do is, because we're going through and we're looping over each existing button, we can do this sort of same code here. When the button gets added to the world, instead of making its associated dropper invisible, instead of making it visible, let's make it invisible. Object. There we go. So what this is going to do is, when a button gets detected, in the world, whether from the added signal or as part of the built-in ones, not only are we going to hook up the touch event, but we're also going to find its associated dropper and hide it. And then when you stand on it, in theory, it should find that associated dropper and set it to be visible. Let's see if this code is working. So this is what our level looks like currently. But when I start up, you'll see that that dropper has already been set to invisible. And that's because our code that is attaching the handlers to the button is also hiding its associated dropper. And now when I stand on it, there's our dropper. It's already there. And the button is working. So that is really nice, because not only have we hooked up the button and the dropper to work, but if I duplicate these things together, and I can do a whole bunch of them, each one is going to be associated with its individual dropper without me needing to change any attributes, without me needing to update any names. When I stand on that one works. When I stand on this one works. See? I've not had to change any of the code or any of the hierarchy. It just sort of works. So that's a really powerful feature of using the collection service, using object values, and sort of how to use the AI assistance feature to sort of write some of this code for you. You can definitely keep that comment around. Oops. If you need to know what it's doing. But if you don't, you can also get rid of it. It's not going to remove the part of the code that Roblox wrote for you. There you go. So let's just add a comment so we don't forget what this is doing. This is showing the associated, I wish I could spell, associated dropper. And this is hiding the associated dropper. Whoops, wrong type of comment. Hiding the associated dropper. So that is really cool. We now have buttons that buy their associated item. And right now, of course, there's no concept of money in the system. So even though they all say that they require $100 to buy and we have no money, it still works. We'll get to that. But for now, we've already hooked up a system of a button making something visible. And that is pretty neat. So what do we need next? Well, I think we sort of need to think of this concept of money, right? That's probably the next piece that we need. Droppers need to drop something that make money, and buttons need to use something to check if we have enough money. The first thing I'm going to do is get rid of all these extra buttons, because I'm not ready for those things to be spread all over the place yet. Okay, So let's think of what we need for our money system. Well, I think one of the first things we need is a conveyor belt, right? Let's get a conveyor belt working and let's make the dropper drop something onto said conveyor belt. So, how do you make a conveyor belt? Well, probably the easiest way is to just sort of add yet another part. We'll turn on collisions for that and we'll make it big enough so that the dropper sort of sits directly in the center. We'll have it spread down there and we'll give it, I don't know, what color is a conveyor belt? Purpley, navy blue? Sure. And make sure to anchor it because it's a brand new part. We don't want it bouncing around. Now, the way that we can get a conveyor belt working is really easy in Roblox. There's a thing called the assembly linear velocity. And if a part isn't anchored, this will basically make that part move in the direction that you specify. But because our part is anchored, the part will stay still, but anything touching that part will move because it will get the same assembly linear velocity as if it was stood on a moving part. So we want ours to look, and I'm looking in this top corner right here, we want it to move in the X axis. You see that little symbol up here shows you which axis is which. So we want it to move in the positive X axis. So let's have stuff move in the positive X axis by 10. Now, if I start this, you should see that if I stand on this without moving now, the conveyor belt's working. So that's a really easy conveyor belt system. If I try and run upstream, it's slow. If I don't, I will move to the end. So that's neat. We'll call this one our belt because it's basically a conveyor belt. And then at the end, let us have another part. And when something hits this part, it's basically going to get sold, right? So this will be our seller, I guess. And it can be any color you like. I don't know, yellow. Does it really need to be smooth plastic? Probably not. Make sure that we anchor it though. That's very important. And also we need to make it a bit smaller so that things can sort of fall into it. So we'll make it 0.1. It's fine. And then move it to make sure that it is on the floor. So there we go. We have our seller piece. So now we need the dropper to drop something. We need it to go along the conveyor belt. And when it hits the seller piece, we need that to happen. So let's handle the droppers first. What do we need the droppers to actually do? Well, we basically need to wait until the dropper has been built. And when it has been built, it needs to start dropping items. So we need a script that can control droppers, and we could add it to the dropper itself, but then we've seen how that can be a problem if you start changing the droppers later on. So instead, let's make a brand new script inside our script service. We'll call it droppers because it's going to control all droppers. And you know what it's going to do? It's going to do something very much like our button script. We're going to use the collection service. And for each correctly tagged item in our collection service, we're going to want it to run some script. So let's just tidy up this slightly by going tag. And now instead of needing button, 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 which we're going to have to change to dropper, 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 what we're going to do is have a single variable called tag at the top and have all of these things use that variable. So now if I was to copy and paste this later on, that would only need to update this single line. And that's kind of handy, I think, even for this. So let's use it here. So tag is going to be button in this case. And instead of the individual strings for each button, we'll just have tags. So now I can just update it in one place if I decide to change the name of the tag. But here we go. So we have that. Now we need the two functions that do something when they're added and when they are removed. Boop and boop. Now, this is expecting a button model, but of course, it's not really a button model anymore. It's something that we're going to call a dropper model. So here we're going to have a type called dropper model, which is a model. And because we're not really interested in much else, the only thing that we're probably interested in is the drop point, which is a part. We'll probably need that later on. But the rest of it we can just ignore because we probably don't care that there's individual parts in here that all look pretty much the same. They're just part of the model. But I don't think we'll call any actions on them. So you don't have to define everything, just the most useful pieces. And you can always update this later. So now Roblox knows that this object is going to be one of these dropper models, and so is this. So now what do we do? Well, for each dropper, we want it to, well, we don't really need it to do anything yet. So this is pretty cool, and we can fill that in when we need it. But what we want to do is instead, we need a dropper to know when it has been purchased. So one of the things that we can do when showing the associated dropper, what we can also do is use those attributes that we sort of talked about before, but this time we will add one via script. And we'll say it's been purchased, and we'll set it to true. So now, when you buy a dropper, not only is it going to be set visible, but it's also going to be given an attribute called purchased, which is set to true. And when we initially hide them, we're going to set that to be false. So now in our dropper script, we'll come back to this part with the collection service. It's going to be useful later. But really what we need is just code that's going to loop through all of our existing droppers, right? Which we know, oh, actually, let me just update this to be models or something generic so that we don't have to update it every time we copy this script. It doesn't have to be buttons. It can just be models with whatever tag it is. Okay, we're going to want to loop through our list of existing droppers, and when they're found, if that dropper has been purchased, then it needs to generate something that gives us money. Okay? So again, there are a bunch of ways to do this, but one of the things that I'm going to do here is going to have a list of droppers. Much like we did with our buttons, we had a table of buttons that were going to be connected handlers. When we add one, we're going to set that to be true for now. And when we remove one, we're going to be set it to nil because we don't really care. Now we're going to use that comment system again to have Roblox help us create the code for what we want to do next. So let's see if we can get this to work. Loop through all the droppers, and if they have a purchased attribute set to true, then instantiate a new part at the drop point. Let's see if it can help us with that. It's pretty complicated. Here is what it has suggested. It's got this function here called update dropper, and it's getting the drop point. And if the dropper has a purchased attribute, then it's going to create a new drop. It's going to give that position to be the drop point, and it's going to set that to be the parent to be the drop point, which will put it into the workspace. So this is pretty good. This is pretty good, but what it was missing is loop through all the droppers. Okay, so it didn't really do that. That's okay. That's okay. What we can do is keep that function. That is nice. And sort of simplify it. Loop through all the droppers and call update dropper every 3 seconds. Let's see what it does with this. It's given us a while true loop, and for each dropper in the droppers, it's going to call update droppers and then wait 3 seconds. This is pretty decent. This is a loop that I wanted, and it's calling update dropper for each one of these things. Not too bad. The problem is, of course, is that a while true loop is never going to exit, which means we're never going to hit the rest of this code down here. So we don't want it to happen on this main thread. Instead, you can use this thing called task.spawn, which will basically create a new function. Sorry, it will basically run whatever function you pass in on a new thread, which means it won't block anything in the rest of the script. Well, function, what is that really supposed to look like? I think I need brackets. That's what it's complaining at. Okay, so we're going to spawn a new thread, and that thread is going to run this while loop. So that means this will get kicked off on a different thread, and the code will continue running on this thread. So that's nice. We're going to change wait to be test.wait, which is slightly more performant in the latest Roblox. But this is good. So every 3 seconds, it's going to call update dropper. And update dropper says if it's purchased, then drop a part. Think this will work? I'm not sure. Let's have a look. So we're going to start the game. And right now, we don't have any droppers purchased. So it's probably still running that script that says every 3 seconds, loop through all the droppers, but we don't have one. So if I do this, now I have a dropper. Is that going to work or not? I guess it did not. So that's unfortunate. So now you're going to see what you need to do when your script goes wrong. So this has gone wrong, and I'm not entirely sure why. So how do we solve this? Well, one of the really cool things that Roblox Studio has is a thing called breakpoints. So what you can do is you can go back into your script that you think has the issue, and you can click in this margin where it has like an outline of a red circle. And that basically says whenever Roblox Studio executes this line of script, I want you to stop. So if I add a script there, a breakpoint there, what's happened is Roblox Studio is still running code right in the background. The game's still running. It has gone through this loop, it's waited 3 seconds, and now it's gone into here and it's hit this breakpoint. Now at this point, the script has stopped. It's no longer rendering the game because the game is completely paused, waiting for you to inspect the code. And now at this breakpoint, what we can do is we can look by hovering over these things to see what their values are. So one of the interesting things here is that droppers has no values, right? If I hover over this, I'm expecting a table of the droppers containing something that it can loop through. So this is always empty, which suggests to me if I add a breakpoint on here and I sort of delete this breakpoint and I continue the scripts, I'm never going to hit it because for whatever reason, this is null. And you know why this is null? I've already figured it out in my head. But this is a great way of sort of debugging your scripts and figuring out what's going on at each point. Because what's happened there is when I hit a breakpoint, signaled by this little yellow arrow, you can sort of hover over these things and see what the value is at that point in your script. So droppers is null, which means this bit of code never ran, right? This would have added the object into the droppers table, which didn't happen. And I already know why. It's because this tag doesn't exist, right? We didn't actually tag anything called dropper. And so if I'd have had a breakpoint down here, and it would have looked through all the models and it wouldn't have found anything because there is nothing with the name, with the tag dropper. So we can solve that by going into our place, finding the dropper, and adding a tag called dropper. Now this has been tagged, the dropper service will work. It will create that function. It will run this function, will get assigned to that table, and now it should work. So the script is running, it's waiting 3 seconds, nothing purchased. Now something's purchased. You can see the code is actually running. It's generating every 3 seconds an item at the drop point, which is, because it's not anchored, it's affected by physics, which is dropping onto the conveyor and sliding along. Now, unfortunately, our seller doesn't do anything, so they're just going to pile up. But now, how cool is that? we've got a dropper that sort of works with very little effort on our part because we got Roblox Studio to sort of do that for us. So now we can duplicate this just to check. Sorry, let me undo that. Let me turn off collisions first, then duplicate it and do this. So now we've got 3, and I've changed no line of code. I've changed no attributes. I've changed nothing in the hierarchy, and this is just going to work. That one's going to start generating stuff every 3 seconds and make a new one. Now that one's going to generate stuff every 3 seconds, and then another one every 3 seconds. Boom. How cool is that? We've got basically a cool looking tycoon, even though we've written very little script, and we can easily edit it by just duplicating things. So again, I'm going to delete those now that I added them. Sorry, I deleted the wrong one. That one wants to go away. That one wants to go away. That one. Because we'll come back to those once we've got everything sort of working. But there we have a dropper. Dropping stuff. And next time we will look at making those items get sold for money and using the money to purchase the buttons. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring that notification bell, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time.